In this video lecture, we're going to be focusing on the methods and functions in string. But before we begin, I want to go over a general idea of what a function is in Python. I'm going to give it the name type, so I'm going to describe the type function in Python. And the idea here is that a function takes an input, it gives you an output, and before it gives you an output, it applies some sort of functionality on the input coming in. So for an example, if I were to say x is equals to 5 and I were to use the type function on x, what's going to happen is the input is the variable x. There's some sort of application happening. We're not really sure what happens in that black box, but the output is this thing, right? The int, the data type of that variable. Now, this is the basic gist of what a function is doing. When we come around to making our own custom functions, we'll talk more in detail on what happens inside that black box. But for the time being, the only thing you need to know is that sometimes functions don't need an input. Sometimes they need more than one input. Sometimes they don't have an output. So as an example, if I were to use the print function, and let's do print of x. I'm going to do this in blue. Well, the input is for the print function is going to be x, so this is the print function. And then what applies to it is that it will go to your terminal and it's going to give the value 5. It writes it down on the terminal, right, for the user. But you'll notice that there is no output for a print function. So to demonstrate, what you can do is you can do something along the lines of y equals print of x, and then I want you to print the value of y. And you'll notice that this thing prints none to the terminal. And that's because the print function by itself doesn't really have an output. So nothing is being stored in y, or none is being stored in y. So if you print nothing, it's going to give you none. Okay, we'll talk more about functions and how we can make them in the coming weeks. But another distinction I want you to make is what a method is. A method is a function that is applied to one object. And it could be a string object, a integer object, or any other objects that we know of. Now, if you remember me mentioning in the beginning weeks that everything in Python is an object. So when you do something on the lines of var equals hello, and you say, okay, well, var is a string variable, and you're not going to be wrong, but you also need to remember that var is also a string object. So what a method is that it can only be applied on var. So I could use the type function on, let's say, var, and let's define var2 here to be, let's say, 123. So I can apply the type function on var, and that's going to give me a string, and I can do it on var2, and that should give me a integer. But to apply a method, and because it's only applied to one object, this object, let's say, I run it like var dot upper. So upper is a method, and so this method, which is a function, is only going to be applied on this guy. You can't really apply it on the var2 or anything like that. So again, if I have, let's say, variable a to be hello and variable b to be world, I can do something along the lines of a.upper, and what the upper method does, it converts, gives you a string back, which is just the uppercase version of your string, and b.upper, and it's going to give me the uppercase version of world. You'll notice that me doing a.upper is not going to affect b at all. And me doing b.upper is not going to affect a at all. So a method is a function that is applied to just one object individually. So every string variable that you create, you're going to have a bunch of methods that you can apply on top of it. So let's look at them. Let's look at a set of methods that I think you should know for strings, and we'll go over in detail about them, what their inputs and outputs should be, and how to use them. So I will be going through a select few string methods. The entire list is in the textbook, so feel free to go and check that out. I'm going to talk about 10, and let's list out the first 5, and we'll go over in detail about what they're doing. The first one is the count method, the find method, the index method, the is alpha, and then the is digit, and we'll go over 5 more in a bit. So for each of them, I will tell you what their inputs and outputs are and how they're being, what they're basically doing. So for the count method, you will pass something in here. So this is x is going to be, in this case, x is a character or a substring. And the output of this count method is how many times x is in a string. So I'm going to continue using this example of var equals hello here. And so as an example, if I were to do var dot count of, let's say, the letter L, this will give me 2 because it's counting how many times x, which is currently our letter L, is in my string, which is twice. Okay, the find method also takes an x here, same with the index. So the find and index method are very much the same thing. They basically tell you the starting index of a substring or character x in a string. So if I were to do var dot find, let's say h, this will give me 0 because 0 is the starting index. So the count method tells you how many times L is going to be in your string. The find or the index method, they both do the same thing. They will tell you what was the starting index of a character or a substring. A distinction, or the difference between these two, is that if the find method is unable to find a substring in your string, let's say, let's use the example of the letter J. So if I were to try and find the letter J in var and I know it doesn't exist, this will give me -1. So it won't break your code, it'll just say -1, meaning there was no index for it. But the index method, if looking for something that is not actually there, will cause an error. So you might want to use the find method when looking for substrings or characters and not the index method if you're afraid that your code's going to break and it's going to break the flow and continuation of your code there. The next one is alpha, and these two guys, they do not take, so let me actually define them separately. These alpha method takes no input in here and returns a Boolean value. So Boolean, again, true or false. And same for his digits. So no input returns a Boolean true or false. And so what the isAlpha is looking for is that if the entire string is made up of alphabets, so if var is completely made up of alphabets, so if I do var dot is alpha, if var is just made of alphabets, this will return true. Otherwise, it'll return false. And same thing goes here. So if, let's say, x is equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, x dot is digit, is going to return true because x is entirely made up of numbers. And you might notice this, but if I were to define, let's say, y equals ABC1, 2, 3, none of these methods are going to give you true for y. So y dot is digit is going to give you false, and also y dot is alpha is going to give you false. And that's because even though the string contains both alphabets and digits, they're not entirely made up of alphabets or entirely made up of digits. The isDigit and isAlpha methods are really, really good when you're trying to anticipate a user input and you're not really sure if the user is going to comply and give you the inputs you need. So if you were looking for a number from the user to use in your calculator and the user gave you alphabetical numbers, or for that input the isDigit is false, you might want to go back and ask the user again. So I'm going to define a variable here. I'm going to call it var, and it has the value hello space world. And so let me list out, we need to check the count method, the find, the index, the isAlpha, and the isDigit methods here. Okay, so I'm going to print out the values because all these methods do return something. These two, alpha and isDigit, will return to you the Boolean values, but these guys usually return a number. Count returns how many times a substring is inside a string, and find and index will return what was the starting index of something, a substring within your string. So let me do var.count, and let's do the letter O. And let's run this one, and you'll notice that it gives you 2 because there were 2 O's in our variable. I can also do world, so the entire substring, and there's only one world in there. Fairly simple to use. The find method again, and I'm actually gonna use both find and index at the same time. So let's say I want to print var.find of the letter E, and then var.index of the letter E again. And they should both give us 1s. Okay, so at index 1 there is the letter E there. And one thing to note here is that if I were to replace E with O, you'll know that there are 2 O's in here. Well, what both of these methods do is that they will only return the first instance of a substring. So even though there are 2 O's in your string var here, so at index 4 and 5, 6 at index 7, but they're only going to return to you the first instance. And if I were to put j in there to see what happens, the find method will give you -1 because it wasn't able to find j in your string, but the index method is just going to break your code. So you get an error and it says substring not found. So I do recommend using find over index going forward. Okay, the isAlpha method. Let's see what that does. So I'm going to print var.isAlpha, and remember it does not really take any inputs. I'm not going to pass anything in here, and we're going to run that, and we'll see that it returns false. Now, why is that the case? Well, that's because there was a space in there. The space is not an alphabet. So if I run this again, it now returns true. And I can do a similar thing here for the isDigit. Let's say var is now, let's say var is now 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's print var.isDigit here, and you'll get true and true, and let me remove that for now. So var was 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is all digits. And if I do 123.4, because the dot, the decimal, isn't really in the number system, this method will return false. But they're really good, these two methods, in testing out user inputs for your programs. Okay, so let's continue with the remaining 5 methods here, and we're going to start with the upper and lower methods. So upper and the lower. We're also going to talk about the title method, the replace, and finally the split method. Okay. So for these two guys, the inputs, there are no inputs. And the output are, so the return a string, which is the upper or lowercase form based on what method you're using, case version of string. So if I'm going by the same example and I say var equals, let's say, h uppercase E L L O, me doing var.upper, and I'm not going to pass anything in here, it's going to give me uppercase hello, and me doing var.lower is going to give me lowercase hello. Pretty awesome methods to use in Python here. The title method, very similar. So what it's doing is it's not going to take any input, and it's going to return a string. So returns a string with title case. And the title case, what that means is after every space. So let me do this. Let's say this was hello space world, maybe. So hello space ORLD. We'll do var.title, and this will return uppercase H hello space uppercase W world. These 3 methods are really good when you're formatting your strings and showing a lot of input or text to the user. Very useful to have. The replace method is one of the more complex ones, and the idea here is that it will take 2 inputs, actually. It'll take, let's say, I and J, and what's happening here is that it will return a string where I is replaced by J in the original string. And I and J are characters or substrings. And when we look at the examples of how the replace method works, well, it'll get more clearer, but here's an idea of what that might be looking like. So in my variable var, I want to replace, let's say, space with a ampersand. And the way I would do it, I would say, okay, var.replace, and I'm going to pass 2 things. So I'm going to say what I need to replace. I want to replace the space, and I want to replace it with the ampersand. And this will return a string to me, which will look like hello ampersand world. Please remember that strings are immutable, so I'm not actually going back and changing the original string here. Instead, I'm returning a new string that you can even store back in the original variable, but this is not mutation in any sense. Okay. Lastly, the split method it will take, let's say, a x where x is a character or a substring, and converts the elements into list form. And as we look at more examples of this, I'll explain this more. But first, let's see some examples of the upper, lower, title, and the replace methods. So I'm going to use the same hello world here variable that we've been using. And let's look at the upper, the title, and the replace methods. Okay, so let's do this. Let's say I'm going to define a new variable, u, and that's going to be the uppercase version of var, and I'm going to print it to you. And if I run this, you'll see it's all upper cases. For the lowercase version, let's say we do L is equals to var.lower, maybe, and print L, and that gives you the lowercase version of this. And we can also do the title. So let's say T is equals to var.title, and it will return the title version of things. There's also the capitalize, so works on the same footing as the so let me just print that out for you. So var.capitalize, and what that will do is it will only uppercase the very first, the starting letter, and not every letter that is separated by a comma here. So these four methods now, title, capitalize, lower, upper, very useful for formatting your strings, but let's now look at the replace method in a lot more detail. So I mentioned that with the replace method, you want to first specify, you want to know what you are replacing in a string, and what are you replacing it with. Oh. So in that case, let's do, let's say replaced var is var.replace. I'm going to replace the space again, this guy, with the ampersand. And I'm going to print replaced var to you. And just to show you that it did not actually modify or mutate the original var, I'm going to print that to you too. So I'm going to say this is the replaced var and then the original var. So you'll notice that the space was replaced by an ampersand, but then var by itself remains the same. It does not change at all. Okay, now say I wanted you to replace the space with an ampersand and then replace the hello with the goodbye and then the world with universe. So that's a multiple, it's a more than one replacements happening over there. So one way you could do it is to say, okay, after line 6 is executed, replace var will currently look like this, right? It'll look like this. Well, I could then say that replaced var is now replaced var dot replace now hello with goodbye, and then replaced var is equals to replaced var dot replace world with universe. So after line 6 is executed, replace var will contain a string version of var where the space is replaced by the ampersand. After line 7, hello will go away and goodbye will be there in its place. And then after line 8, world will go away and will be replaced by universe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this replaced var and show you after every single replacement what's going to happen here. So this was after the first replacement, so take away the space, put an ampersand. This is after replacing hello with goodbye, and you'll notice that the ampersand still is there because we're modifying the string over here. And then goodbye becomes universe. So we have been redefining the value of replaced var every single time with a new replace method. Now, this sort of becomes a little tedious. And a way to have a fix around this, so if you had multiple replace, because now I could mention, oh yeah, I'm okay with this, but I also want you to make it uppercase. So you will then do okay, fine, so is what you get. But you'll notice that you're reusing variables, and this is not the most efficient way of doing things. So instead, what we can do is we can chain methods together. Because I know that the replace method and the upper and the lower and the title and the capitalize, they all return a new string, I can apply string methods on top of them. So in that case, I will remove this line. I will actually take away this part too and do this. And finally, I'll go over in detail over what's happening here too, and I'll do this. And finally, I'm gonna replace this part, and I'll do that. And I'm gonna print replaced var over here. And that gives you the final version, right? So what happened here? Well, everything will be evaluated piece by piece. So first time, this piece will be evaluated, which gives us hello ampersand world. On that string, whatever is returned, I'm applying a new replace method, saying in that string, if there was a hello like this, replace it with goodbye, and we'll do that. And then on top of that entire string that's generated, I want to use another replace method to replace world by universe, and it will return, again, this is a replace method, it's going to return a new string to you, and I'm going to apply upper method on top of it. So in the end, you'll get goodbye ampersand universe all in upper cases. Let's look at how it's working. So I've made some space here, and I'm going to write down a string. I'm going to say var is equals to hello space world. And let's try to chain var dot upper to var dot replace, let's say, the space with percentage sign, and then chain that to var dot let's do var dot title. And then we'll also try to chain that to var dot find ampersand. So I want to chain all of these methods together, and so remember, if you weren't looking for chaining, it will look something like this. You'll do, okay, x is equals to var dot upper, then x is equals to x dot replace, so x dot replace space with ampersand, and then so in this case x will be uppercase hello world. Now you're replacing the uppercase hello world with the space in there with the ampersand, the percentage sign, and then you're saying, okay, make this the title, and then whatever's made up from all of that, try to find the index of the percentage sign. So that's the long form, but let's chain things together. So we know that var.upper, in this case for the original string, is going to give you hello space world. So if I were to chain dot replace with percentage sign on top of it, I'm actually saying apply this replace function on method on this new string that's generated, right? That's what chaining basically does. You don't have to store that back into a variable and then apply the next method on top of it. Instead, you can just do it one by one. So, okay. And this whole thing will result in hello percentage sign world, because that's what the replace method is telling us to do. And then if I were to then chain, because that's the next thing to do, if I were to then chain dot title, okay, on top of it, that's me saying apply it here, on top of here, and on top of this guy, basically. So this will now result in hello world. Please notice that the uppercase W will not happen because there wasn't any space, so Python will think that it's an entire single word. Okay, and then lastly, I want to apply the dot find apply the find method on top to find the index of, well, the percentage sign. And so what that basically means is whatever was the result of this whole line, I'm going to apply it on here. So I'm going to apply the find method on top of this. And if you remember, the find method basically looks for the index, the starting index of a substring, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the final result will be 5. You'll notice that this whole piece of code will also give you 5, but I was able to write in a single line the entire chaining mechanism that I needed to write. And that's basically the idea of chaining methods. Now, I want you to be aware that you have to remember what type or what is being returned from each of these methods. I won't be able to apply the find method chained on the isAlpha, because the isAlpha will return a true or false. I cannot run a find method on booleans. So you have to be aware on what you're applying over and what things you can actually chain together or not. So practice a little about which methods will work when you're chaining and which won't, and it'll sort of get you an idea of, or it'll get you comfortable in what needs to be chained and what doesn't need to be. Okay, we're going to move to the last method. That is a super crucial one, and that was, again, the split method. And I mentioned that you pass in some substring here, x, and what's happening here is the input is a character or a substring, and what this method will do is it will split or divide your string, I mentioned it in the lines of, over that character, over that x value. So all of your elements are going to be chopped into and converted into a list. So this is coming under the realm of our conversion methods here. So conversion between a string to a list. And there is also a list method that allows you to convert back to string, but we'll look at that when we go over lists in a bit. So let's say I had the variable var again, and let's say it's goodbye space universe. And so I could do var dot split on the space, and it will return, this returns a list where basically what happens is that Python will find all the spaces there are in your string, and it's going to chop on that character or substring, and everything becomes separate elements. So you have a list now where you will have goodbye and universe as two different elements in a list. We'll talk about lists in a little bit, but all you need to know is that the string method, the split method, when applied on a string, will ask you to give it a character or substring you want to split on, and then for every instance of that character in your string, it will chop and make small buckets of elements that go in each of those buckets. So as a final example, before we finish the discussion here, I will say, let's say var was, let's say elephant. And if I were to do var dot split on the letter E, Python will say, okay, you want to split on this guy and that guy. And so you should end up with a list where you have, I believe, nothing, and then the letter L, because it's here, there's nothing over here, and then a third element with the fan part of it. And that's what the split method does. When we go over in detail about what lists are, we'll come back to this method and learn more about it.